The protagonist was a celebrated manga artist. He had spent 5 long years enduring obscurity and hardship, only for his debut series to end prematurely. After that setback, his second work exploded in popularity, sweeping across the world and earning both anime and live-action film adaptations. 7 years into its serialization, as that flagship series was nearing its conclusion, an unexpected incident occurred while he was looking at his own reflection in the mirror. In that instant, something inexplicable happened, and he found that he had exchanged bodies with a rookie manga artist. The story opened during the busiest stretch before a deadline. One staff member called out to inform the sensei that 3 pages were ready and asked whether the backgrounds could be checked. A female assistant apologized for accidentally spilling ink on the manuscript. Another staff member, wearing glasses, warned that there was less than an hour remaining before the deadline. The sensei sat calmly in his chair amid the chaos. He reflected that they were facing powerful headwinds, then pressed on regardless. This man was the manga artist Gario Hanagami. Gario rapidly scribbled across the manuscript pages, remarking to himself that these exact circumstances would propel him to even greater heights. He turned over another page as the bespectacled staff member confirmed that the manuscript had been properly received. Gario expressed praise for the team's excellent work and offered his usual apologies, noting internally that the night before a deadline was always one without sleep. A younger assistant wondered what Gario was drawing now. Gario continued working, thinking about capturing the poses of exhausted humans in all their natural splendor, convinced that such sketches would become useful in a scene planned 8 weeks into the future. He continued sketching in preparation, thoroughly enjoying himself. Another assistant observed that, unlike everyone else, Gario was already on his 3rd consecutive all-nighter. Someone else pointed out that he had even been skipping meal break. To them, Gario looked like someone having far too much fun drawing manga to spare a thought for food or sleep. In their minds, they could not imagine him without a pen in his hand. Laughter echoed somewhere in the background. From within that laughter came a scornful voice, dismissing the earlier remarks as textbook examples of throwaway lines and questioning whether the staff felt no embarrassment saying such things out loud. The staff were left confused. Gario turned his gaze toward the source of the voice. Behind a pile of scattered materials sat a man who muttered that the whole scene was utterly pathetic. This was Shinobu Miema, a rookie manga artist. One staff member told Miema to remove his feet from the table. Gario acknowledged him as the temporary assistant who had come to help for the day and went on to praise Miema's outstanding contributions, particularly his work on crowd scenes. Gario was deeply impressed by how flawlessly Miema had replicated his art style, to the point that even Gario himself could not tell the difference. Miema responded with an unenthusiastic nod. One of the heavier-set staff members remarked on Miema's reputation. Miema was known for being extraordinarily skilled at imitating other artists' styles and design quirks. No matter the genre, he could perfectly mimic the work of anyone he assisted. Because of this uncanny ability, people had given him a nickname. He was known as the Chameleon. Miema's eyes flew open as his fist tightened. Gario watched him closely, utterly fascinated, recognizing the sheer magnificence of such a talent. One of the heavier-set staff members added that the real issue lay in Miema's warped personality, which made him a nuisance to any studio he joined. Because of that, Miema had never managed to secure a long-term position, and it was said that editors passed him around like an unwanted burden. Gario put a stop to the remarks, insisting that it was enough and that there was no need to resort to insult. However, by then Miema had already driven a pen straight into his own hand. Shock rippled through the room, reaching even Gario. Miema asserted that this was the truth of it, that imitation was all he was capable of. His editor, whom he regarded as pitiful, had told him the same thing. Creators without individuality had no value. He believed it was better to die than to resign himself to being nothing more than a background extra. Gario reacted instantly, wrenching the pen from Miema's hand and ordering Kinatani to bring the first aid kit. Kinatani complied at once. Gario then addressed Miema, explaining that creation was a process that carved itself deep into a person's psyche. He acknowledged the pain and effort involved but insisted that no human being alive truly lacked individuality. Someday, Miema's hands would produce a work that belonged to him alone. Gario warned him never to harm those hands again. Miema responded by licking the wound and sneering internally at the sentiment. To him, it sounded like empty encouragement, the same tired words repeated endlessly. He thought that people like Gario, those hailed as geniuses, always made a grand display of their hard work while looking down on those who had yet to find success, dismissing them as people who simply had not tried hard enough. They strutted as if effort alone had carried them to the summit, boasting about having shed more blood, sweat, and tears than anyone else, even though countless others worked just as hard or harder and were never rewarded for it. As these thoughts churned within him, Miama gripped the stair railing. Suddenly his hold slipped. His foot missed a step, and co-workers near the doorway cried out in alarm. Miama tumbled down the stairs along with his bag. In the instant he began to fall, Gario lunged forward, trying desperately to catch him. Later that day, at Kamiya General Hospital, a television broadcast reported that the popular manga artist Gario Hanagami had been hospitalized after an unfortunate fall down the stairs of his residence. He had yet to regain consciousness. His most famous work, the ongoing series Doragon Land, was a massive hit with an animated adaptation already released. With 150 million copies in circulation, the manga enjoyed a worldwide fanbase. However, the series had now entered an indefinite hiatus. Elsewhere, someone awoke with a sense of confusion, wondering where he was. He realized that he was no longer in his studio and suspected he was in a hospital. From nearby, he heard the television reporting that countless fans were lamenting the hiatus of Doragon Land. His eyes snapped wide open in disbelief at the mention of a hiatus affecting his series. A woman sitting nearby reacted with surprise, noting that he had finally regained consciousness. The man immediately tried to understand what had happened and asked whether he had been injured, worrying that they could not afford to leave a gap in the magazine's lineup. The woman told him to calm down and questioned whether Miama's thoughts were scrambled. That name struck him like a shock. He could not comprehend what she was saying, because in his own mind, he was Gario. The woman went on to state that the hiatus was Miama's fault, criticizing him for being clumsy and telling him that he would need to apologize to Gario Hanagami later. Gario could not understand how Tanaka had mistaken him for Miama. As that confusion lingered, he noticed a mirror nearby. When he looked into it, shock seized him as Miama's face stared back from the reflection. He reacted instinctively, only to be scolded for making a commotion in a hospital. To confirm the impossible, he pinched his own cheeks and felt the sensation clearly. The realization dawned on him that he was inside Miama's body. He tried to piece together what had happened. There had been an accident at his home, and both he and Miama had fallen down the stairs. With that memory in mind, a possibility occurred to him. He asked Tanaka about the current whereabouts of Gario Hanagami. She corrected his manner of address and explained that Gario had regained consciousness shortly before he did and had gone up to the rooftop to get some fresh air. Not long after, Gario made his way to the rooftop, where he found his own body standing there. The truth became undeniable. By the logic of the situation, if Gario had awakened in Miama's body, then Miama must have awakened in Gario's. To Gario, the entire situation felt like something straight out of a manga plot, and he concluded that they would have to find some way to return to their original bodies. Miama, however, rejected the very idea of reverting. For the first time, he was no longer relegated to being a mere extra. He declared that his dream of becoming a famous manga artist had finally come true. Gario was taken aback by this claim and questioned how such an arrangement could possibly represent Miama's dream. He believed Miama's true wish had been to leave his mark on the world as Shinobu Miama, not by borrowing another man's identity. Miama dismissed that notion outright. In his view, Shinobu Miama had been nothing more than an obscure chameleon, devoid of individuality and utterly pitiful. He felt no regret at severing ties with his former self. Instead, he intended to live on as the celebrated manga artist Gario Hanagami. With his ability to perfectly replicate Gario's art, maintaining the existing series would be effortless. By riding on the established popularity of Doragon Land, he could preserve the status quo without even exerting himself. To him, this was a miraculous gift worthy of divine thanks. Gario confronted Miama, explaining that until moments ago he had been prepared to accept Miama taking over the series if it meant continuing to bring joy to readers. Miama rejected that sentiment, making it clear that he had no intention of allowing Gario any involvement. Doragon Land now belonged to him alone. Gario objected, unable to tolerate Miama's attitude toward manga itself. That, above all else, was something he could not accept. Miama, unfazed, challenged Gario to consider what he could possibly do about it. Any attempt to expose the truth would sound like a ridiculous farce, and no one would ever believe him. Gario stamped his foot in defiance, firm in his conviction that he was a manga artist. If people refused to believe his words, then he would let his manga speak on his behalf. Miama ridiculed the idea, deriding the notion of Gario starting over from the very bottom. To him, it was almost tragic that any work Garyo produced now would inevitably be judged by the world as nothing more than an imitation of Miama's own creations. Garyo, however, laughed it off, confident that Miama could never truly grasp what he understood about dragons. Just as dragons soar higher the stronger the headwinds become, Garyo believed adversity would only lift him further. 2 months later, at the editorial department of Shonen Wonder, a sense of relief filled the room. Someone held a copy of Doragon Land and celebrated the fact that Garyo's hands had remained unharmed. The story itself was just as solid as ever, allowing everyone to finally breathe easy. Another person cautioned against celebrating too soon. Nearby, someone sprawled out on the floor questioned whether releasing it was truly the right call. The first editor asked Tachikawa whether he had spent yet another night sleeping at the office. Tachikawa responded that commuting home was simply a waste of time. As he flipped through the magazine, Tachikawa admitted that while it was good to see Doragon Land return, something about it felt slightly off. Beneath the layers of intense action, he sensed that the dialogue lacked its usual edge. When questioned about whether he could really tell, Tachikawa reflected that the writing had once been razor-sharp, with words that practically leapt off the page and cut straight into the reader's chest. At that moment, a coworker called out to inform Tachikawa that Miama had arrived to see him in booth 2. The name alone made Tachikawa mutter in confusion. Later, in a meeting room, Tachikawa confronted Miama, remarking that it took some nerve for him to show up there. Miama appeared puzzled. Tachikawa reminded him that 3 months earlier, Miama had outright rejected his proposed edits and declared that he would never again show his work to an editor like Tachikawa. He questioned whether Miama had conveniently forgotten that episode. Miama reflected briefly, then laughed, dismissing it as the recklessness of someone who had not thought about the consequences. Tachikawa pressed the point, making it clear that this situation concerned Miama himself. Miama brushed aside the past and abruptly tossed a thick stack of paper onto the table. Tachikawa did not react immediately. Miama prompted him, implying that what lay before him was a 50-page one-shot storyboard of remarkable quality. In Tachikawa's mind, something felt wrong. Miama seemed like an entirely different person from before. Tachikawa noted Miama's brazen confidence and began leafing through the pages, assuming that such arrogance could only produce a sloppy, self-indulgent piece of work. Then he stopped. Without realizing it, he felt himself drawn completely into the story. A sense of disbelief crept over him as he began flipping through the pages more quickly. Each page struck deep, its sharpness perfectly synchronized with the flow of the narrative, making the experience irresistibly gripping. With a manga like this, stopping before the end was impossible. His reading pace quickened, his breathing growing heavy. In that moment, Tachikawa realized that he was reading the storyboard honestly for the first time, not as an editor, but purely from the perspective of a reader. On his second pass through the manuscript, Tachikawa examined it with the eyes of a creator, carefully identifying areas that could still be refined and improved. Even so, the intensity of the work was overwhelming, and his body felt as though it could not endure much more. He finally turned his attention back to Miama, wondering what could possibly have come over him. No matter how he looked at it, it was difficult to imagine the Miama of the past assembling a storyboard of this caliber. Miama responded with unrestrained enthusiasm, asserting that while the body might belong to Shinobu Miama, the soul within it was that of Garyo Hanagami. Tachikawa did not immediately respond, left only with confusion. Miama continued regardless, outlining his plan. First, this one-shot would be published in the magazine. After it gathered sufficient votes, he would produce 3 full chapters worth of storyboards. Once the series was officially picked up, he would stand in the same competitive arena as Tachikawa himself. He made it clear that Tachikawa should brace himself, because this rookie manga artist intended to surpass Doragon Land. In his mind, the image was of a hero seizing the clouds and driving them straight to the summit. Tachikawa reflected that rookies often spoke with grand confidence, always talking big. Yet in that moment, what truly crossed his mind was the memory of a certain man. He recalled the creator of Doragon Land, whom he had met only once before, a manga obsessive known by the moniker of the Dragon. Back at the office, the sound of footsteps echoed as someone entered. The person took a seat and declared that it was time to get to work. It was Garyo, calling out sharply and warning against dozing off. Thus began the tale of a dragon and a chameleon disguised as a dragon, 2 ferocious manga artists locked together on a turbulent, electrifying journey through the world of manga. A brief recap of the previous chapter revealed that, through a bizarre turn of events, the protagonist Garyo Hanagami, a renowned manga artist whose acclaimed series had entered its 8th year of serialization, and Shinobu Miema, a rookie manga artist gifted with the ability to perfectly copy art styles, had exchanged bodies. In the present, the sound of paper being violently torn filled the room. Using Garyo's voice, Miema dismissed one manuscript after another as worthless and unfit for publication, ridiculing them as utterly pathetic. He then laughed in satisfaction before stopping at a single manuscript. This, he decided, was the one. It perfectly embodied his ideal vision of shonen wonder. Aside from Doragon Land, he judged that every other work could vanish without consequence. Kinatani approached, hoping to have something checked, but she was brusquely dismissed and told to proceed however she liked, as long as she followed the usual method. He added coldly that because she was slow with a pen, she should not bother coming in the following week. Kinatani was left stunned and tried to reason with him, while the other staff members silently continued scribbling away at their desk. Tanaka, watching the exchange, felt a sinking certainty that something was wrong. Kuramoto privately thought that the sensei's behavior had changed ever since the fall. Miema, still inhabiting Garyo's body, declared that his editor should take note and prepare to assign him a new assistant he could actually use. Rintaro Hikawa, the editor in charge of Doragon Land, responded internally that no matter how unreasonable Garyo's demands became, he would comply as long as it ensured the delivery of manuscripts. Miema approved of this attitude, recognizing Rintaro as exactly the kind of obedient editor he needed. As he moved about, Miema stepped on something and noticed a magazine on the floor announcing 3 new one-shot. The third title caught his attention immediately, Blue Sky Brigade by Shinobu Miema. He froze, then read the name again to be sure. Shinobu Miema. The realization visibly shook him. Later that day, Tachikawa was on the phone apologizing to the person on the other end. He explained that although he was eager to review the manuscript being shown to him, there was still something at the office he needed to finish first, and it would likely take another 30 minutes. He suggested that the other person go find a restaurant and order whatever they liked in the meantime. On the other end of the call, Miema responded casually, explaining that he had already anticipated this and was in the middle of stuffing himself with food. He added that eating was the only way he could keep his anger from boiling over. Miema then asked whether Tachikawa had read the latest chapter of Doragon Land. Tachikawa inferred that Miema must be fed up once again this week. Miema confirmed it emphatically, expressing frustration that week after week the series was filled with half-hearted page compositions and sloppy dialogue. For someone who was merely copying outlines from beginning to end, the quality of Garyo's current work was far worse than Miema had ever imagined. Tachikawa admonished him internally for talking while eating and thought that, given the circumstances, Miema had every right to be angry, considering that he was, in truth, the real Garyo Hanagami. As Miema reiterated that he would soon be sending his storyboard up the editorial chain, Tachikawa asked him to repeat what he had said earlier. Miema calmly restated that they had swapped bodies, that he and Garyo had exchanged places after falling down the stairs. Miema took a sip of his drink, inwardly expressing gratitude toward Tachikawa. Meanwhile, Tachikawa was seized by alarm, fearing that he might have driven one of his artists completely off the deep end and that he needed to bring him back to reality. Yet the memory of the manuscript he had read earlier left him unsettled and uncertain. Conflicted, he raised one final question in his mind. Assuming Miema's claim was true, why was Miema still drawing manga at all? Miema paused, looking at him as he considered the question. He swallowed hard, then suddenly broke into a fit of coughing. Tachikawa immediately wondered whether he was all right and questioned what that reaction meant. Miema explained that when he tried to imagine a life in which he did not draw manga, an overwhelming wave of nausea hit him. It was a miserable outcome, made worse by the fact that an ice cream float had gone to waste in the process. Tachikawa reacted with dry amusement, concluding that Miema truly was a hopeless manga junkie, the kind of creator people called a dragon. From his perspective, all that remained was to expose the imposter and prove the truth through the magazine debut of the reborn Garyo Hanagami. Miema informed Tachikawa that he had refined the storyboard included in the manuscript and expressed hope that Tachikawa would take the time to read it thoroughly. Tachikawa laughed, thinking that this hardly sounded like a joke at all, and remarked internally that they would be seeing each other soon enough. Miema acknowledged this calmly. Nearby, at another table, excited voices suddenly rang out in response to a manuscript. Someone marveled at how insanely detailed the artwork was, then expressed surprise that it had been drawn by the girl sitting there, praising her talent and wondering whether she was already a professional manga artist. They commented crudely that they had not realized there were attractive women like her in the industry. Flustered, the girl stammered that she was still new and asked whether they needed something from her. One of the men peered at her manuscript and questioned whether it was meant to be a shonen manga. When she tried to stop him, worried that he would damage the pages, another man behind him casually told her to relax while placing a hand on her shoulder. He suggested that she might want to spend time with them afterward. She refused, explaining that she had an upcoming meeting with an editor. Ignoring her discomfort, the first man called the other's attention to something else, showing him an image and making crude remarks about how lewd it looked. The second man agreed enthusiastically, commenting on how arousing it was. They continued by making insinuations about her work, suggesting that she was far less innocent than she appeared and mocking her for drawing provocative poses. One of them fixated on the realism of the clothing she had drawn and speculated crudely that she must have used her own body as a reference, even imagining her posing in front of a mirror. When she weakly pleaded with them to stop, they only escalated, one of them openly admitting that the thought excited him. Inside, the girl was breaking down. She had poured her heart into that manuscript for her very first pitch meeting, and now she was being ridiculed for it. She began to cry, begging them to stop mocking her effort and to stop laughing. Instead of backing off, one of the men complained that this was troublesome, since she could not possibly attend her meeting with tears streaming down her face. He tried once more to persuade her to come along with them, claiming they would comfort her. At that moment, a suitcase struck one of the men sharply on the cheek. Miema stood there, observing that they seemed to have plenty of free time. He suggested that instead of what they were doing, they might enjoy reading his manga, which would be far more entertaining. The man demanded to know what Miema's problem was. Miema began to assert that he was no ordinary troublemaker and that they were looking at Shinobu Miema, whose body housed the soul of someone else, but he stopped himself. Remembering Tachikawa's warning to keep the body-swapping situation to himself, he realized that saying more would only make people think he was mocking a famous artist. He therefore introduced himself simply as Shinobu Miema. The second man reacted with loud disbelief, unable to understand what Miema was talking about. The girl, however, murmured Miema's name and asked whether he was the artist with the upcoming one-shot. Miema confirmed that he was and presented the manuscript. The girl's eyes widened in amazement, and she asked whether she might be allowed to take a look at it as well. Miema invited her to read it freely, and she thanked him. Before she could reach for the manuscript, however, the first man stepped in and snatched it away, asking whether Miema minded if he went first. Since Miema had talked it up so much, he warned that if it turned out to be boring, he would tear it up right in front of him. Miema offered no response. The girl reacted with shock, unable to believe someone would say such a thing. The second man pulled the first aside and whispered that he should tone it down, reminding him that damaging property was a crime. The first man dismissed the warning, convinced that Miema was bluffing and that this would end with him embarrassed and retreating. Miema fixed them with a serious look and quietly remarked that this would not do. The first man smirked, unsure what he meant. Miema stated that there was no time, leaving the man confused. He then apologized and asked that they pass each page along as soon as they finished reading it. The first man, the girl, and the second man ended up grouped together with the manuscript. Miema explained that he understood their desire to carefully examine every panel, but asked them to listen to him, as his editor would arrive at any moment. In his own mind, he reflected that depriving readers of their freedom was something no artist should do. The first man grew irritated, thinking about the audacity of Miema's attitude. He wondered whether Miema believed himself to be all bark and no bite. He reaffirmed to himself that if the manga turned out to be lame, he would tear it apart without hesitation. Miema acknowledged this calmly, expressing confidence that the man would enjoy it, so there was nothing to worry about. The man and the girl exchanged uncertain looks. Scoffing, the man thought Miema a fool as he opened the manga. In his mind, the man resolved that regardless of what the manga was about, he would tear it apart and humiliate Miema. He intended to skim through it as quickly as possible. Yet as he read, he found himself drawn in completely. The title, Hush Little Baby, Don't Say a Word, pulled him back into memories of his childhood. Back when they played pretend, everyone wanted to be the heroic lead or the central character. No one ever wanted to be cast as a minor villain who gets beaten at the beginning. Now, having grown up while running away from his problems and constantly choosing the easy path, the man recognized himself as a lonely villain who caused trouble for others without caring, the kind who gets defeated at the very start. Within the story, the protagonist reflected that there was nothing wrong with taking the easy road in life, but that one should still strive to become someone they could admire. Those words struck deeply. The girl burst into tears, overwhelmed by how incredible the work was. The dialogue felt as though it ravaged her entire body, and she realized she had never read a manga like this before. Her heart was still racing. The second man admitted that he too had been moved to tears, finding himself identifying with the character who betrayed others midway through the story, acknowledging how easy it was to be swept along by circumstances. Miama observed their different reactions with quiet satisfaction, thinking how wonderful it was to witness such varied responses and recognizing this as the benefit of having a live audience. Miama then asked for their verdict, wondering whether they had enjoyed his manga. The first man looked at him and admitted that he had. It was the first time in a long while that he had felt that childlike sense of wonder again. Lost in thoughts about his past, he offered an apology for all the trouble he had caused and confessed that he had been rude. The girl responded with a gentle smile. The second man admitted that he too had gotten carried away and offered his apology. Miama responded with a gentle smile. Later, the girl told Miama that she could not thank him enough. He even agreed to exchange contact information with her. She declared that she would consider herself a devoted fan and insisted that if he ever needed help, he only had to ask. Tachikawa observed the exchange and remarked internally on whether Miama was flirting, but Miama regarded it simply as expanding his network through manga. The girl soon said that she needed to leave. She waved to them, expressing her excitement at the thought of reading Miama's one-shot again once it was printed in the magazine. Miama waved back as she went on her way. At Hanagami's residence, Rintaro arrived to meet him. Rintaro questioned what Hanagami had just said earlier. Hanagami chuckled and made it clear that there was no need to feign ignorance, since he had already stated plainly that Shinobu Miama's one-shot was to be kept out of the magazine or else he would quit. Rintaro murmured in disbelief at the word quit and asked whether Gario intended to take a break. Gario clarified that he meant he would never draw again, at least not for Shonen Wonder. Rintaro pressed him further, asking whether this drastic decision was truly because of a single rookie's one-shot and requested a clear explanation. Gario responded that he simply did not want to be in the same magazine, and questioned what was wrong with cutting one rookie's work. Rintaro replied that if forced to choose between the two, his decision was already clear. Gario took this as confirmation, convinced that Rintaro was exactly the kind of compliant editor he needed. Rintaro then stated that he would negotiate with his superiors to place Doragon Land on indefinite hiatus. Gario was taken aback and demanded to know whether Rintaro truly understood what he was saying. Rintaro affirmed that he was fully aware. He explained that regarding Gario's series and contractual matters, he would accommodate Gario's wishes as much as possible. However, it was an editor's duty to nurture every title, and they could not bring themselves to crush a work before it ever reached the public. Gario muttered to himself as the implications sank in. Miama was already on his way under his own name, and even though Gario had finally become the protagonist, was he now going to return to being an extra? He recalled the time he had lived as Miama, being praised for his ability to draw so well, for producing art that looked exactly like the real thing. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the room as Gario sprang to his feet, his chair crashing to the floor. He abruptly told Rintaro to forget everything he had just said, dismissing it all as a joke. Doragon Land would continue as before. Rintaro struggled to process the sudden reversal, but Gario ended the meeting for the day and shut the door, leaving Rintaro outside. Inside the room, nothing could be heard but the frantic scratching of pen against paper. Gario continued muttering his own name over and over as he scribbled aggressively, his eyes sharp and unwavering. Later, among the magazine stacks, the 51-page one-shot Blue Sky Brigade by Shinobu Miama was also released. Upon inspection, there were no missing titles or noticeable errors. It was time for a bit of reconnaissance. Miama began flipping through the pages. He turned another page, and then another, until he found himself completely absorbed in the work. It felt as though light and power were emanating from the manga itself. Miama's eyes filled with determination as he reflected that the chameleon had truly gone and done it this time. Another day arrived, and conversations everywhere were buzzing about the new chapter of Doragon Land. Readers spoke excitedly about how overwhelmingly intense it was. One remarked that it felt like the first truly tear-jerking, god-tier chapter in a long while, noting that the story had been in a lull recently despite most of Doragon Land being of the highest caliber. Others celebrated it as the triumphant return of a king, calling it marvelous. Attention also turned to the one-shot released that week, with readers observing that it demonstrated consummate technical skill. Some wondered aloud whether it could truly be the work of a rookie. Others voiced concern, lamenting that its style resembled that of the king himself and worrying that the two works would cannibalize each other's vote. Tachikawa himself could hardly believe what he was seeing. The framing of the battle scenes, the polished dialogue, the gripping flow of the narrative, these were all techniques characteristic of Garyo Hanagami, elements that had been missing until now. And yet, in just a single week, the Chameleon had managed to reproduce them. He had crossed the line and become a genuine dragon. In Tachikawa's mind, he wondered whether the presence of the real Hanagami's work had ignited something fierce within him. He could not comprehend how someone could flawlessly imitate the original art style and storytelling techniques in such a short span of time. A colleague contacted Tachikawa to inform him that a manuscript had been uploaded to the shared drive, which Tachikawa acknowledged with thanks. Another coworker asked whether he had seen the latest Doragon Land and remarked on how incredible it was. Tachikawa agreed. The coworker admitted that there was no way he could compete against something like that and joked that he needed alcohol just to cope. He invited Tachikawa out for drinks, but Tachikawa declined, explaining that he still had work to do. The coworker teased him for being dull. Privately, Tachikawa thought that Miama was only 2 train stations away and decided it might be worth stopping by. Later that day, Tachikawa found Miama seated at his desk. Miama immediately conveyed that he had already lost. Tachikawa noted the irony of giving up before the survey results had even been announced. He handed Miama a small gift. Miama dismissed it, stating that there was no need to look. The latest chapter of Doragon Land already bore his presence within its pages. It contained the story and world that had been built through countless cycles of trial and error, the manga techniques that had been studied, tested, and refined over time. More than anything, it embodied the new step that Garyo Hanagami took with his soul each week, venturing into the dark unknown together with the many readers who followed in anticipation. Standing as Garyo Hanagami himself, Miama understood that he stood no chance against an already established series like Doragon Land. Tachikawa responded with blunt honesty. For a work to become a global phenomenon, it was not enough for its quality to be high. It had to seize a moment, to spark something explosive, before it could ever reach that level. He believed it was extremely unlikely that a new series would emerge anytime soon that could surpass Doragon Land. Miama remained silent. Tachikawa continued, admitting that there was still one thing he could not understand. Even with the Chameleon's unparalleled talent for imitation, how had he managed to fully become the real thing in only a single week? Miama explained that the Chameleon had likely relied on the dragon scrolls he had left behind. When Tachikawa asked what those were, Miama described them as his tomes of manga know-how, records that detailed every secret the real Garyo had accumulated over the years. There were 13 notebooks in total, all locked away inside a safe at his studio. Tachikawa acknowledged that if the Chameleon had access to those, then reproducing Garyo's techniques would be more than possible. However, a realization struck him. Miama had just said the scrolls were locked inside a safe, which meant the Chameleon should not have been able to reach them at all. Miama dismissed the concern, explaining that it was not an issue because he had sent Garyo the passcode on the very day they swapped bodies. Tachikawa reacted with disbelief, thinking how reckless that was. Miama countered internally that taking over a weekly series was no trivial matter. Tachikawa conceded that point, but helping an enemy certainly was. Then again, recalling everything Miama had said up to now, Tachikawa realized it did not sound as though Miama had been acting out of hostility or misplaced sympathy toward Garyo. Miama brushed it off, believing that things had worked out perfectly. He now had the chance to compete directly against his own magnum opus, an opportunity that did not come around under normal circumstances. If he could not triumph as Garyo Hanagami, then he would prevail as the new version of himself. The first obstacle would be exactly as the Chameleon had described earlier. Any work he created from this point on would inevitably be judged by the world as an imitation of the Chameleon's work. With his current art style, Miama understood that he would have to grow an entirely new set of fangs. In Tachikawa's mind, it was natural to expect other artists in the magazine to aim for the top, but very few were truly serious about challenging Doragon Land. Now, however, the very mind that had created that legendary series was starting again from square one. Tachikawa informed Miama that he had 3 months before the next serialization meeting. Miama asked for confirmation, and Tachikawa affirmed it, advising him to take his time devising a strategy. Miama quietly repeated the words to himself, 3 months, as Tachikawa nodded. Miama then opened his refrigerator, finding it completely empty, and checked his bank account. Rent, miscellaneous fees, electricity, art supplies, transportation, phone bills, water, gas, health insurance, pension payments, premium food costs, one expense after another weighed heavily on him. Elsewhere, inside another building, a phone rang. It was Tachikawa, calling to ask about openings for assistant positions. The person on the other end replied that he was currently at the office and would ask around. He also inquired whether it was a traditional studio that still worked with pen and paper, noting that such setups had become quite rare in the modern era of wonder. Later that day, Miama stood before a new workplace, having been summoned on short notice to help out. He described himself as the ultimate temporary assistant. He almost introduced himself by his real name before quickly correcting it and stating that he was Shinobu Miama. He greeted the assistants around him, but it was clear that everyone there was already completely absorbed in their work. The serialized manga artist Kaintake Nakano apologized for troubling Miama. Nakano explained that with the deadline rapidly approaching, they needed extra hands to compensate for their own shortcomings. He expressed genuine gratitude that Miama had come to help and admitted, with self-deprecation, that he was always imposing on others. Nakano even went so far as to think that he deserved to be crushed by a falling rock, only to be met with the suggestion that crawling under one would suffice. Realizing he had gone off on a tangent, Nakano apologized again and moved on, saying he would assign Miama some task. Miama noted internally just how often Nakano apologized. Nakano then asked whether Miama was the chameleon. The chief assistant, Kanako Kita, remarked that Miama's reputation had preceded him, and reminded him that the situation in the studio was already dire. She warned that he should not create any additional problems for them to deal with. Miama acknowledged this and agreed to comply. Nakano's manga, Tinhead Warrior, had initially found success as a one-shot, but its popularity declined just 2 chapters into serialization. As time passed, its ranking continued to fall. At the serialization meeting 2 weeks earlier, it had been announced that the series would be cancelled. Miama thought back to how he had experienced the same fate when his own debut series had been axed early. When that happens, no matter how harmonious a studio may have been, both the artist and the assistants begin to walk on eggshells around one another, and an oppressive tension settles in the air. Even so, Miama knew he had to endure these gloomy conditions. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by a raised voice. Something was happening. Nakano was trying to negotiate, speaking into a phone, saying that he understood and asking for some time to think it over. When Miama asked what the call had been about, Nakano turned to him, clearly shaken, and explained that it concerned redoing a 2-page spread. He said the call had just been from his editor. Because the spread was meant to be the highlight of the chapter, Nakano had shown it to the editor in advance. However, the editor did not think it looked impressive enough and had requested a complete redraw. Kita objected, pointing out that the background had already been fully filled in and all the finishing touches had been applied to those pages. They were already struggling just to meet the deadline, and time was running out. Miama then proposed an alternative. Instead of the current close-up framing of Nakano's artwork, they could pull back the perspective and use a wide shot. By doing so, the background could carry the visual impact in place of the characters. That approach would drastically reduce the amount of time and effort Nakano would need to spend on a redraw. The other staff members praised Miama's idea, recognizing that it might actually work. However, Kita immediately raised an objection. Shifting to a wide shot would place the burden squarely on the assistants. Their current workload already had them stretched too thin, and there was no time to call in extra help. The question remained of who would be able to draw such an ambitious background under these conditions. Miama told them to leave it to him, while adding that the final decision ultimately rested with Nakano. Nakano paused to think it over. Kita interjected that if, by some chance, they ended up missing the deadline, Nakano would lose the trust of the editorial department. She questioned why he should take such a risk when he would still have more opportunities in the future. A redraw, she argued, would not change the reality that the manga was already beyond saving. Before she could finish, Nakano cut her off, saying that she was right. At this point, he had no hope of escaping last place in the rankings, and he did not want to burden everyone any further. He apologized to the team and said there was no point in stressing over such a trivial manga. Miama's expression twitched. Nakano went on to say that they should prioritize simply meeting the deadline. Miama, however, said he was curious and asked how Nakano's manga had performed in the previous week's reader survey. Nakano was initially confused, then replied that it had placed dead last, and asked Miama not to make him say it again. Miama clarified that he was not asking about the ranking, but about the actual number of vote. Nakano was again taken aback. Miama pointed out that he had never heard of a series receiving 0 vote. The magazine was full of popular works, and if even a single reader had enjoyed Nakano's series enough to cast a vote for it, then as its creator he should not dismiss it as a meaningless manga. Nakano was deeply moved. In his thoughts, he addressed his mother, recalling how he had finally gotten his own series, born from a one-shot he had published not long ago. He remembered the character he used to draw and show off back in elementary school, the very one who had become the protagonist of this manga. He imagined thanking everyone and promising that he would do his best. At the same time, another memory surfaced, of quietly muttering that it was last place again this week, and of the harsh realization that his series would likely be cancelled at the next meeting. He remembered being told that he was still young and should use this experience to grow. After reading the online criticism, he had finally come to believe that his series was worthless. He had been overwhelmed by the negativity, despite having built this story from nothing with his own hands. Now he wondered how he could have been so heartless toward his own work. Nakano asked his team whether it would be all right to redo the spread. The staff looked at one another and smiled, agreeing without hesitation. Nakano said they would get back to work immediately. They would divide up the remaining panels so that similar backgrounds were assigned to the same person. He suggested turning it into a game to help them stay awake, proposing a classic Wander series quiz. Kita reflected that the heavy tension in the room had vanished in an instant. No, that was not quite right. Miama had swept it all away. She found herself wondering whether he truly was the notorious chameleon everyone talked about. Nakano placed his hand on the table and announced that he had decided on the new layout. While he continued working on the inking, he asked the others to complete the background. He knew it would be a demanding task, both in terms of time and skill. Miama, brimming with energy, urged them all to soar to even greater heights. Nakano instructed Miama to take the buildings from the previous page and draw them as if they were exploding outward from the point where the characters would be placed. The concept was that the city itself was being blown apart by the collision between the protagonist and his arch-nemesis. From a narrative standpoint, all of the residents had already evacuated, so there was no need to include any background characters. Nakano acknowledged that this was an extremely demanding task, but he said he was counting on Miama. Watching Miama, Kita thought there was no way he could already be inking. The pages contained only a handful of rough outlines. Was he serious? She understood that it might save time, but even so, drawing such intricate backgrounds in a single pass seemed impossible. Yet, on the page, buildings began to take shape. Then came the depiction of an explosion. Another structure appeared, followed by a scene in which it was split cleanly in half. The sound of Miama's pen gliding across the paper filled the room, like that of a dragon moving through the city. It was as though a dragon were slithering between the buildings themselves. Miama looked over what he had drawn and then set his pen down. The entire team had been watching him. Nakano stared in silence. The backgrounds of the shattered buildings were solid and complete. Nakano's eyes widened. At that moment the doorbell rang. It was Kayashiro Akagi, the editor in charge of Tinhead Warrior. Akagi thought to himself that he had made a huge mistake. He felt sorry for Nakano, who must have been deeply disheartened after learning that his series was being cancelled. Akagi questioned why he had insisted on asking for a redo of the two-page spread. Although Nakano had agreed, given his current state of mind, Akagi doubted, he still had the motivation to improve it. They had worked closely together ever since Nakano first pitched the manga. It had been Akagi's first pet project, and, more importantly, Nakano's first serialized work. Akagi did not want things to end this way, on such a bitter note. That two-page spread represented their final battle, and that was precisely why Akagi had steeled himself and requested the redo. As things stood, he would have been satisfied just to receive a completed manuscript. Kita opened the door and greeted him. Akagi asked about the message Nakano had sent, saying they were finished. Kita hesitated. When Akagi entered the room, he saw Nakano still drawing, his expression filled with determination. Nakano apologized to Akagi and asked him to wait just a little longer. Kita explained that Nakano had already completed the freehand drawing once, but after sending that message, he had reconsidered. Nakano apologized again, saying that the spread was not good enough and that he was going to rework the characters one more time. The team was taken aback. Nakano explained that since the characters had originally been cut and pasted from a different page than the background, it should be possible to redraw them and swap them in. The others asked him why he would go to such lengths. Nakano explained that the reason was simple: his own art could not compare. Miama's background work was completely outshining his characters. That was why he intended to keep drawing them, again and again, until time finally ran out. Akagi was deeply moved by this resolve. Kita asked Akagi whether he would mind waiting a little longer. Akagi replied that it was no problem at all. Tears streamed down his face as he thought that he did not care if his boss scolded him or if he had to beg the printing company for forgiveness. For this week alone, he was willing to wait as long as it took for Nakano to feel satisfied with his work. Akagi recalled the moment he had congratulated Nakano on getting his series, telling him that they should dream big and aim to take down Doragon Land. Eventually, Akagi left. Miama and the others smiled as they saw him off. In Miama's mind, Nakano's editor was truly his most loyal voter. He smirked at the thought. Kita asked him why he looked so smug, saying that he seemed as though he had just arrived at some profound realization. Miama said it was something akin to an observation and that he was about to explain, but before he could finish, Kita told him to help with the cleanup. Miama replied that he was exhausted. While the others tidied up, Nakano said he would cover everyone's commuting expenses and asked them to tell him how much he owed. At the same time, Kita stared at her screen in shock. Miama asked what was wrong. Kita explained that someone she knew had offered her a job as a regular assistant, working 5 days a week and paid daily. For her, it would be a life of plenty with no famine. Miama commented that it was very encouraging, but also pointed out that working 5 days a week would severely limit the time she could devote to her own manga. With that in mind, he offered her his wisdom, the secret arts of saving time. His notes included advice such as cramming sleep into 1.5 hours, bringing 3 chapters worth of storyboards to weekly meetings, commuting while working, and using the back of a backpack as a surface to draw storyboards on the train. Kita told Miama to be realistic. She added that she was an illustrator by trade. It was her younger sister who came up with the stories, and that was why she was training as an assistant. Miama gaped at the idea, marveling at the thought of a sister tag team, calling it proof that they were truly living in a new age. Kita asked him where he found all that energy. She then shared that her younger sister was currently struggling with writer's block, but when she finally got into the groove, she became an absolute beast. At that moment, Miama noticed something and asked whether she only owned a single nib holder. Kita answered that she did, explaining that this was because she exclusively used a mapping pen. Normally, artists switch between 2 types of pen nibs. Variations in thickness respond to pressure and are well suited for character art, while finer nibs are ideal for delicate lines and complex backgrounds. Each has its purpose, so using 2 nib holders is considered standard practice. However, assistants usually handle finer details and character work. Instead of relying on the bold, dynamic single strokes of a G pen, she preferred the aesthetic of overlapping fine lines for her primary line work. Miama absorbed this explanation. Kita added that, on top of everything else, mapping pens were simply cuter. Suddenly, Miama grabbed Kita's hand, declaring inwardly that this was it. She was startled, thinking that she had sworn never to pursue a workplace romance. In Miama's mind, however, the realization was simple. To force a change in his art style, all he needed to do was change his tools. This would become his new Fong. Miama burned with passion. Kita asked him what his problem was. Her phone vibrated. She checked it, and her eyes widened as though she could not believe what she was seeing on the screen. Miama asked what was wrong. Kita asked whether he knew about the upcoming party celebrating the 60th anniversary of Shonen Wonder. Miama replied that anyone associated with the magazine could attend. Brimming with excitement, Kita explained that Gario Hanagami would be there to give a speech. The information came from a trusted assistant friend. She had been waiting for this moment, as she would finally be able to meet Hanagami in person. She had been a fan since the very beginning. In Miama's mind, the Chameleon would be there as well. He smiled to himself. The other staff members excitedly said they wanted to go too, one of them remarking that it would be perfect if they all marched in together. Nakano apologized for interrupting their excitement, explaining that he needed to pay them right away. Before the body swap, the others would praise Miama, remarking that it was no wonder he was called a chameleon, as he could reproduce his sensei's art style perfectly. Another coworker would marvel at his remarkable talent and suggest that he should stay on as a regular assistant. The original Miama, however, would respond that it was a real pain to recreate all of those awkward proportions. A coworker, taken aback, would ask what he had just said. Shinobu Miama was, after all, a rookie manga artist with a knack for copying art styles. Meanwhile, on another team, assistants would ask their sensei whether he truly intended to redraw the pages so late in the process. Their sensei would affirm that he did. The original Gario Hanagami explained that he had ultimately decided this approach was much cooler. One assistant would protest that the new character already had plenty of screen time that week. Another would say they could not help with the inking, and a third would agree that there was barely any time left before the deadline. Garyo would counter that barely any time did not mean zero. To him, compromise was a sin against the readers. Garyo Hanagami was a veteran manga artist known far and wide. In a bizarre twist of fate, the two of them had swapped bodies, and now their ideals collided on a tempestuous journey through the world of manga. That afternoon, there was a knock at the door. It opened, and Tanaka informed Garyo that they were about to order delivery for lunch, asking whether he wanted anything. Garyo declined. Tanaka added that she did not mean to impose, but he had not eaten a proper meal in quite some time. Before she could finish, Garyo glared at her, making her feel exposed in that instant. Turning his back, Garyo stated that it was impossible to soar high on a full stomach. Tanaka conceded. In her mind, she could not stand those eyes, which seemed to see straight through her. Garyo muttered to himself, wondering why, now that his dream had come true, he felt such displeasure. Elsewhere, Miama stood staring at something, lost in thought. The next day, at the general reception, a constant buzz of chatter filled the air. Kita was giddy at the spectacle around her, marveling at the massive venue and the extravagant food. She recognized Professor Tosaka and noticed him speaking with Joichi, the star of the live-action film adaptation. Her eyes sparkled at the sight of such an all-star ensemble, and she thought it must all be a dream. Miama remarked that the venue had not changed at all, reminding him of when his mentor had brought him there for the 50th anniversary. Kita reacted in disbelief, noting that he would have been in elementary school 10 years ago. Miama ignored her and pointed out that he had spotted his favorite dessert, red bean daifuku, and was about to head over. Kita grabbed him and stopped him, telling him not to wander off. She asked why he thought she had dragged him there in the first place. Miama guessed it was because she had no other friends to invite. Kita denied that and instead surprised him by producing a fully packed suitcase. Miama realized it was filled with Doragon Land merchandise. Kita explained that after joining the industry, she had always assumed she would eventually be called to assist on Doragon Land, and when that day came, she planned to ask Garyo to sign all of it. She asked Miama whether he understood just how hardcore a Hanagami fangirl she was. Miama, who was in truth the original Garyo Hanagami, simply continued chewing his food. Kita went on, explaining that the day she had been waiting for was finally here, which was why she needed a mutual acquaintance like Miama to introduce her properly. Miama agreed, noting that he himself happened to have a few words he wished to say to Garyo. Kita then wondered aloud whether anyone even knew what Hanagami looked for in a woman. She admitted that she was not accustomed to dressing up, but she had put some thought into her outfit that day. It was not as if she had ulterior motives, she merely wanted to make a good impression. Thinking about how Garyo tended to sideline his heroines, she speculated whether he preferred busta women. Miama reflected that he was not sure he was qualified to judge, but he explained that in shonen manga, drawing characters with larger chests often made their silhouettes easier to distinguish, and that this was not necessarily a reflection of the artist's personal tastes. Just then, someone recognized Miama. Tanaka remarked that Miama was there as well and noted that she had not seen him since the hospital. Miama remembered her immediately. Tanaka asked whether his body was doing all right, and Miama assured her that there were no problems, thanking her for her concern. Tanaka then asked whether Kita was Miama's girlfriend. Miama clarified that she was not, introducing Kita as a fellow artist and a kindred spirit he had met while working as an assistant. He also explained to Kita that Tanaka was one of the long-term regular assistants on Doragon Land. Kita noticed Tanaka's fuller figure and felt a wave of gloom, thinking that she had known it all along and that sensei must like women with larger chests. Tanaka asked what was wrong, and Miama replied that he did not know. Tanaka shot back that he really did not, but added that she was glad to see at least one of them doing well. When Miama asked what she meant, Tanaka explained that the boss, Garyo, had been acting strangely lately. Ever since he returned to work, his personality had seemed warped, radiating nothing but bad vibes. Since then, the change had only grown more pronounced, to the point that it felt as though an alien had replaced him. Whether Garyo was driving himself mad or being driven mad by something else, Tanaka could not say. She acknowledged that this might come with the territory of a long-running series, but Garyo had lost his usual cheer, and she would rather have his old warped personality back than see him remain as he was now. The other assistants felt the same, as they were all fond of Garyo and could not help but worry. Kita again thought to herself that she had known it. Miama apologized for causing them stress, but Tanaka asked what he was apologizing for, pointing out that there was no reason for sensei to apologize at all. She said that she was the one choosing to worry. She then bid them goodbye, saying she would catch them later and that the boss would be arriving soon. She reminded Miama to greet Garyo properly and be polite. Miama smiled. Turning back to Kita, who was still munching behind him, Miama remarked that slowing down would not make her grow any bigger. Kita sniffled and replied that she had not known that. Elsewhere, a car sped along the road. Looking ahead, the driver remarked that, judging by the traffic light, they should arrive before the end of the party. Sitting behind him, Garyo Hanagami glared silently. The driver shivered and glanced back again. Garyo asked what had put him into such a panic, and the driver wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him. Garyo instructed the driver to keep his eyes on the road, reminding him that the passenger he was transporting was none other than the great Garyo Hanagami. Soon after, they arrived at the venue, where Hanagami's arrival was formally announced. On the evening after Hanagami finished his assistant job, a voice rang out to point out that what was happening was not permitted. Tachikawa explained that company rules strictly prohibited showing submissions to anyone other than the artists themselves. Miami responded by asserting that he was the artist, and added that he intended to use every resource available to him. Tachikawa clarified that the work in question was Garyo's submission for a monthly award from the previous year, and that another piece had been submitted for the Tosaka Award. To be honest, neither work had left much of an impression, and naturally neither had one. Tachikawa further remarked that he could not see how reviewing the Chameleon's past works would be of any help to Miama in his current situation. That same evening, Hanagami's arrival was announced. Garyo muttered to himself that he had a feeling Miama would come. Miama turned his gaze toward the entrance. Kita quickly stepped forward, explaining that she was one of Miama's assistant friends. She introduced herself as Kanako Kita and, with visible shyness, asked Garyo for his autograph. Miama observed the exchange quietly. Garyo paused for a moment, then smiled and agreed. He asked if there was a particular character she liked, and Kita requested a drawing of Viola. Garyo praised her choice and mentioned that he had big plans for that character. Hearing this, Kita reacted with excitement and said she could not wait. As Miama watched, he noticed something about Garyo's finger. Before the swap, Miama remembered someone pointing out that Garyo's pinky tended to stick out. That person had said it always happened when Garyo used a marker. Garyo had agreed at the time, speculating that it might be due to the thick grip. Returning to the present, Miama reflected that only his former editor should have known about that habit. Garyo finished the autograph and handed it to Kita. Miama thought that, by mimicking not just his artistic touch but everything from the way he held his pen to the amount of pressure he applied, Garyo seemed to have subconsciously copied even his habit. Kita was overwhelmed and thanked Garyo repeatedly. She explained that although she owned several replica autographs of his, the real one was on an entirely different level. She said she would treasure it until the day she died and expressed her deep appreciation for his generosity. Miama reflected that he himself would never have the tact to handle such a situation so skillfully. Kita then ran over to Miama, bubbling with excitement, asking if he had seen what just happened and remarking on how incredibly nice Hanagami-sensei was. Garyo turned his gaze toward Miama, and the two stood facing each other. Miama expressed his thanks, admitting honestly that he had not expected the chameleon to recreate Doragon Land with such faithfulness. Garyo responded with sharp sarcasm, dismissing Miama's gratitude as carefree. Miama countered that the chameleon had been given the chance to compete against his own prime self. Garyo questioned whether Miama was still trying to play the protagonist and declared that Miama repulsed him. After becoming Garyo, he said, he had come to realize something. Miama could never possibly surpass Doragon Land. Miama scoffed at this and thought that if Garyo was referring to the art style, then Miama had already found a solution. Garyo responded by thinking that Miama was probably considering changing his pen nib. He gestured casually with his palm, conveying that Miama was an open book to him. The chameleon remarked that, after all, this was Shinobu Miama they were talking about. Before coming here, he had asked his editor about how Miama's one-shot had performed, and learned that it placed fourth overall. Garyo laughed at this, convinced that Miama had never imagined losing to anyone other than himself. Miama did not know the reason for that result, did he? He could not figure it out, could he? Garyo insisted that Miama should not worry, because the work itself had been perfect. However, as Hanagami, the chameleon who knew him so well, Garyo declared that Miama possessed a fatal flaw, and that flaw was the reason Miama could never soar higher than him. Miama found himself unable to respond. At that moment, the host asked whether Garyo was ready, explaining that they would like to hear his closing remarks. Garyo took the opportunity to offer Miama some personal advice, telling him to learn his lesson and remain where he belonged, like a good little extra. Miama muttered inwardly that Garyo absolutely reeked of confidence, though he would have expected nothing less from himself. Still, since the chameleon had effectively thrown down the gauntlet, Miema demanded one promise. If Miema could prove Gario wrong, then Gario would help him return to normal. Gario looked amused and readily agreed, wondering why not, since Miema did not have it in him anyway. He admitted that he was disappointed, as he had believed Miema possessed extraordinary strength of spirit. Yet Miema really could not endure it, could he, being reduced to a lowly extra? Miema responded that this was precisely where Gario was wrong. He had grown genuinely curious about what made the chameleon tick. Feeling guilty, he had flipped through the rejected storyboards in his room and his past magazine submissions. Those materials proved him right. There was nobody out there who lacked individuality. Now, he felt an intense urge to read an original work by Shinobu Miema. Gario's eyes widened. Miema told him to remember his words, because he would come out on top. Miema then turned and walked away. Kita called out, asking whether he was leaving, and Miema confirmed that he had already said what he needed to say. Gario muttered that they would settle things with Manga. At the same time, Miema also resolved that they would use Manga to decide everything that remained between them. As all eyes were on the two of them, the host cleared his throat and announced that they would proceed with the closing remarks. The host was jolted when Gario remarked that he finally understood how things stood. Outside, Kita commented that Miema had been awfully quiet and asked whether he was feeling down. In her mind, those words exchanged earlier had sounded like fighting words, though she wondered if the criticism had cut deeply. She admitted that she could not follow half of it, but encouraged Miema not to let what Hanagami-sensei said get to him, reminding him that Hanagami was not right all the time. Miema denied that he was affected. If that was the conclusion Hanagami had reached after becoming him, then it meant he truly had a fatal flaw. Things were heating up, and Miema vowed that he would fight tooth and nail to rip off that mask, Shinobu Miema. Meanwhile, Gario muttered to himself that his displeasure stemmed from seeing another version of himself wearing the face of a protagonist. Unless he broke Miema's spirit, his dream would never come true. Thus ended the encounter between Gario Hanagami and Shinobu Miema, with both sides inflicting deep wounds upon each other. The story moved into its next stage. Inside the building, someone voiced their exasperation. Tachikawa remarked that the party should be ending around now and questioned why they were the only ones still putting in overtime. Rintaro told him to save his complaints for when there was someone he could actually blame. Another coworker commented that it was not so bad, pointing to the documents in hand and mentioning the editorial department's new project, the Rookie Serialization Bootcamp. Putting effort into cultivating new talent was a good thing. Rintaro scoffed at this as naive, and Tachikawa agreed. He explained that the person behind the proposal was the infamous Rookie Crusher Deputy Editor-in-Chief, Chibiki. Their coworker gulped, and Tachikawa added that this was not the only reason for concern. All they could do now was hope that things would end without incident. At the beginning of Chapter 7, the topic of a serialization bootcamp was raised. It was explained that the team was eager to have Oiwa participate. Oiwa admitted that he was unsure how to feel about it, given that he was already 31 years old. To him, it honestly felt as though the ship had already sailed when it came to ever obtaining a series. The person speaking with him encouraged him to lift his spirits and demonstrate the power of the so-called golden generation. Oiwa responded with a smile, thinking to himself that if they truly insisted on giving him a chance, then perhaps he should take it. When the group arrived at their destination, a short-haired woman instructed them to follow her. In Oiwa's mind, a sense of certainty settled in that he was completely out of his depth. There were 6 participants invited to take part. To qualify, they had to have published their first one-shot within the past 2 years and placed 7th or higher in the reader survey with that work, all without having secured a series. In other words, these artists were brilliant supernovas who had made dazzling debuts. By comparison, Oiwa felt like an old-timer who had only just debuted in his 30s. To make matters worse, he had barely managed to scrape into 7th place, and that was only because Doragon Land had been on hiatus and another hit series had been out of rotation that particular week. Someone walking ahead glanced back at Oiwa and smirked. Oiwa was taken aback. In his mind, there was no doubt that the man must have been thinking something along the lines of why a geezer like him had been invited. A gloomy feeling washed over him, and he wanted nothing more than to leave. Just then, bells rang, and the woman announced that they had arrived. She welcomed them to the Vernal Summit House, explaining that this would be the stage for the Invitational Serialization Bootcamp. As an aside, she mentioned that the property was owned by their company. One of the girls remarked that the place gave off a heap of suspenseful, murderous vibes and hopped about excitedly. Another girl questioned whether there were not supposed to be 6 participants, as she could only count 5, and wondered if the last one had dropped out. The woman reassured them that this was not the case, explaining that Miama had actually been the first to arrive and that she had already shown him his room. The girl reacted with recognition upon hearing the name. Another contestant noted that Miama was the artist who had caused a stir with the issue that was hailed online as the true return of Doragon Land. Yet another added that Miama had placed an astonishing 4th and was the one to beat at this boot camp. At that moment, someone could be seen enthusiastically waving at them from one of the windows. The woman remarked that, speaking of the devil, he was waving at them right now. There he was. Miama called out cheerfully, urging them to come on so they could gush together about manga theory. One of the girls wondered whether Miama was being cocky. A male contestant remarked that it felt more like they were being patronized. The woman overseeing them commented that they were like oil and water. Miama looked over at the group, and the woman instructed everyone to settle into their rooms and rest until noon. As Oiwa entered the building, he was struck by how enormous it was, reminding him of something straight out of a Resident Evil setting. The accommodations were arranged with 2 people per room, and his assigned roommate turned out to be the man who had been waving earlier, Miama. Oiwa felt some relief, thinking that at least Miama seemed friendly enough. Inside the room, Miama was already absorbed at his desk. He muttered to himself while adjusting a panel, thinking that the middle panel would look better at an angle. The piles of manuscript pages rustled as he worked. Taking in the scene before him, Oiwa instinctively recoiled. This kid was clearly another supernova. In his mind, Oiwa acknowledged Miama's astonishing level of focus. Miama had not even noticed him entering the room. Oiwa decided not to disturb him. At the same time, he could understand why the others were wary of Miama, and he reasoned that Miama's one-shot must have been exceptional as well. Oiwa picked up a book. As he reflected on the success of younger artists and the debuts of gifted rookies, he felt a growing sense of discomfort. He could not bear to watch any of it anymore. These days, the only wonder manga he still read were the few long-running series he had followed for years, such as Doragon Land. This was a far cry from his earlier days, when he devoured everything from fresh works in the sister magazines to the winners of the monthly awards. Over the past decade, the passion within him had steadily faded. Every time his storyboards came back marked with a bold X, it chipped away at him further. He regretted agreeing to come here at all. This boot camp was exactly the kind of vivid display of talent he had been trying to avert his eyes from. Suddenly, Miama turned his head toward Oiwa. Oiwa was startled by the abrupt movement. Miama reacted as if something had just clicked for him, leaving Oiwa confused. Miama enthusiastically addressed him by a familiar nickname. Oiwa was taken aback. They had never met before, and yet Miama had just called him Iwachi. Only one person ever used that nickname, Hanachi. Oiwa was far better known by his pen name, Gario Hanagami, the creator of Doragon Land and one of Oiwa's peers. Oiwa wondered how Miama could possibly know that nickname. Miama reacted with visible embarrassment, covering his mouth and gulping before explaining the connection. He revealed that Hanagami had told him all about Oiwa back when Miama had been a mere assistant working in his area. Hearing this, Oiwa accepted that explanation, thinking it made sense. It felt like a blast from the past. A memory surfaced vividly in Oiwa's mind, of Gario excitedly calling out to him and praising his storyboard as a work of genius, while at the same time bluntly declaring that, as much as he hated to burst Oiwa's bubble, he himself would be getting a series before Oiwa ever did. Gario laughed playfully back then, while Oiwa would have retorted in his heart that there was no chance of that happening, insisting that he would beat Gario to serialization first with the work he had in his hands. Returning to the present, Gario was reminded of how, long ago, they used to compete fiercely over who would be serialized first. That rivalry belonged to a distant past. Miama noticed Oiwa's distraction and asked what was wrong. Oiwa brushed it off, saying it was nothing and telling him not to worry about it. Oiwa then asked why Miama had arrived so early and alone. Miama explained that he had been so excited he could not sleep at all, so he had written his greeting by hopping on his bike and riding at full speed through the night, arriving by morning. His eyes gleamed with enthusiasm. Oiwa could hardly believe it, realizing that Miama had biked all that way without any sleep. Miama added that he had been fired up from the very moment his editor invited him, thrilled by the idea of a boot camp for manga artists, and he chuckled to himself as he said it. Oiwa muttered inwardly that it was no joke, wishing he could summon even a fraction of Miama's enthusiasm. He admitted that he had been on edge ever since hearing about this opportunity. For someone who had debuted as late as he had, getting a series felt like nothing more than a pipe dream. In his own mind, he felt that he did not belong here at all. Miama's eyes widened at that admission. He asked whether Oiwa wanted his own series. Oiwa was taken aback by the directness of the question. Miama went on to reason that if Oiwa did not want one, then it would make sense for him not to belong here, but since they all shared the same goal, they were equals, or rather, rivals. Oiwa's thoughts drifted back to the time when he had praised Hanachi's series, calling it excellent and promising that he would catch up soon. He thought about his own unrealized series. Just then, a gong sounded. Miama reacted in surprise, realizing that it was already noon, and urged Oiwa to go with him. Oiwa agreed. The woman overseeing them clapped her hands to gather everyone's attention. She explained that they were 10 minutes behind schedule because it had taken time for everyone to arrive and line up, and reminded them that a good manga artist must always be punctual. One of the girl participants thought to herself whether this woman was some kind of grade school teacher. By then, the camera crew had finished setting up their equipment. The first girl participant pouted, thinking that the cameras made it feel like a variety show, and she had not signed up for a face reveal. The second girl reasoned that backing out was not an option, since this was a special project. The woman explained that, as they had all consented to beforehand, this boot camp would be treated as entertainment. It would be promoted on the company website, as well as through video streaming services and their digital manga app. One of the male contestants cut in impatiently, saying he had had enough of the boring talk and wanted to know how he could get a series. The woman acknowledged this and said she would skip ahead to the explanation part that everyone knew and loved, but before that she introduced herself. Her name was Maki Shirmaki, a team leader in the Wonder editorial department. Her earring chimed softly as she spoke. Maki then announced that the format of this boot camp was very simple. Each day, the participants would complete a single trial. Based on their performance, they would be given a rank along with a corresponding number of points. First place would receive 6 points, second place 5 points, and so on. On the final day, all of the points would be tallied. The participant with the highest total would be awarded both the right to publish a serialized work and an additional bonus prize. One of the participants muttered to himself that there would only be one winner, noting that this was exactly what he had expected. Miama, growing impatient, demanded to know what the trials would actually be, wondering whether they would involve storyboards, illustrations, or something else entirely. At that moment, a loud thump echoed through the room. A man entered from behind them, gripping an axe in his hand. He groaned as he weakly called out to Shirmaki. The participants recoiled in shock, some shouting in panic and likening him to a zombie. One of the girls remarked that the entire scene gave off murderous, haunted mansion vibes. Maki calmly identified the newcomer as Chibiki, the deputy editor-in-chief, leaving everyone stunned. She thanked him for chopping the firewood and observed that his negative aura seemed even thicker than usual. Chibiki replied that there had been no end to the wood outside. The participants were left puzzled by the mention of a negative aura. Chibiki then scolded Maki for having the nerve to order around the supervisor of the boot camp. Maki casually remarked that it looked like he had been drinking tomato juice, pointing out stains on his face. The participants exchanged uneasy thoughts, wondering whether this was that old cliché. Chibiki bluntly corrected her, stating that it was blood. The word sent a wave of panic through the group. However, Chibiki calmly took a seat and explained that a deer had died behind the building, so he had given it a proper burial, which accounted for the stains. Maki then handed Chibiki a set of notes, explaining that they contained the rundown of the boot camp details. After reading them, Chibiki declared that the rules were far too lax and announced that he would be adding an extra condition. Maki questioned whether he could do that without consulting her first. Chibiki responded by asking whether they were all familiar with Wonder's blacklist. Acts such as rigging survey results, threatening or assaulting editors, plagiarizing other works, or stealing artwork were grounds for being permanently severed from the magazine. Anyone who strayed from the proper path of a manga creator would lose all ties with the publication. A single misstep was enough to land someone on the blacklist. One of the participants remarked that he had heard rumors about it, while one of the girls wondered aloud whether it truly existed, finding the idea terrifying. Chibiki then announced the new rule. Whoever finished this boot camp in last place would be added to that very blacklist. Maki immediately objected, having feared that Chibiki might propose something extreme, but arguing that this punishment was far too severe. She warned that without a penalty-free option, some artists might choose to withdraw altogether. Chibiki responded by saying that they should simply ask them whether they would stay or leave. Maki smiled helplessly, realizing that there was no point in arguing further, as Chibiki had already made up his mind. At that moment, someone raised a hand. One of the participants pointed out that if even one person withdrew, there should be no penalty, arguing that it would otherwise be unfair. Maki turned her gaze toward him. The participant went on to explain that, for example, if half of them were to drop out, then only 3 artists would remain, and each of them would face a much higher risk of being blacklisted. Furthermore, once someone withdrew, the remaining participants technically could no longer finish in last place. Under those circumstances, it would only make sense for the penalty itself to be removed. Maki immediately praised the logic as an excellent point and accepted it on the spot, asking whether that sounded agreeable. A compromise had been reached. In her mind, Maki felt relieved, believing they had avoided the worst-case scenario. Exiling a rookie through this project would surely cause an uproar, and she was confident that at least one of the 6 would withdraw. A hand came down on someone's shoulder, accompanied by a remark that it was his cue. Oiwa was startled. The same participant who had spoken earlier addressed him dismissively, telling him farewell and calling him a gramps. Oiwa was caught completely off guard. The participant suggested that if Oiwa were to drop out, the younger contestants could enjoy a friendly competition without the burden of fear. It was not as if Oiwa was aiming for first place anyway. He urged Oiwa to make way for the up-and-coming generation. Oiwa found himself torn. Sweat beaded on his skin. In his own mind, he acknowledged that the man was not wrong. He did not need to be told something he had been repeating to himself from the beginning. It was obvious. He did not belong here. He was just about to raise his hand when another hand suddenly reached out and grabbed his. Oiwa froze in confusion. Miama was holding on to him. The other participants shot them sharp glares. Miama intervened, urging Oiwa not to do it. He acknowledged that the participants' words lacked tact, but insisted that Oiwa could not respond with violence. Oiwa and the participant both turned their attention to Miama. Oiwa asked what Miama meant by that. Miama told him to think back to his former self. He reminded Oiwa of the time he had worked with an artist who disparaged his favorite anime heroine, when Oiwa had ranted and raved but never turned violent. He brought up the occasion when Oiwa had asked a friend to critique his storyboard, only to lose his temper as soon as 3 flaws were pointed out, leading to an all-night argument, yet still without resorting to violence. That was who Oiwa truly was, a passionate man who remained true to himself. Oiwa looked at Miama and admitted that it was unbearably embarrassing. He said that he had been young and foolish, and that those memories should really be sealed away. Hanachi talked far too much. Still, he thanked Miama because he remembered now. In his mind, Oiwa recalled Miama asking whether he wanted his own series. He had been unable to answer earlier because he had realized the truth. Buried beneath 10 years of failures was something he had lost sight of, the very reason he had entered the manga industry in the first place. Oiwa then declared that he would not withdraw. He would get his own series. He introduced himself as contestant number 1, with a one-shot ranked 7th, in the sports genre, under the name Genji Oiwa. The earlier participant muttered that a no-risk scenario would have been ideal, but there was no way he himself would end up at the bottom. He introduced himself as contestant number 2, with a one-shot ranked 4th, in the mystery genre, named Hayato Kamaya. Another contestant followed, stating that without risk, nothing could truly rock, and introduced herself as contestant number 3, with a one-shot ranked 5th, in the dark fantasy genre, named Akeo Yakuno. A girl giggled and declared that she was all about good vibes, introducing herself as contestant number 4, with a one-shot ranked 3rd, in the horror genre, named Fumamai Inakawa. Contestant number 5 said nothing at all. He was the creator of a one-shot ranked 1st, in the classic fantasy genre, and his name was Taman Sasaki. Maki cautioned them not to get swept up in the moment, warning that this was how people stumbled in their youth. Sometimes, she said, the best decision was to walk away. She then turned to Miama, pointing out that it ultimately came down to him. She urged him to consider how the risks outweighed the rewards, reminding him that even if he backed down, he would still have more opportunities in the future. Before she could finish, Miama declared enthusiastically that regardless of the risks, he would not back down. He introduced himself as contestant number 6, with a one-shot ranked 4th, in the classic fantasy genre, named Shinobu Miama. Maki could hardly believe it. Chibiki, however, brought the matter to a close, announcing that the invitational serialization boot camp would now officially begin. At the beginning of Chapter 8, a voice rang out in disbelief. An editor wondered aloud whether Shermaki was not in the office that day. Tachikawa replied that she was probably hosting that boot camp event. The editor reacted with delight, thinking himself fortunate. Tachikawa told him he was being far too candid, though he admitted that he understood exactly how he felt. The editor brushed it off, pointing out that Tachikawa was not part of Team Shirmaki, so how could he possibly understand? Tachikawa countered by saying that Shirmaki had led his training when he first joined the company, and even now the sound of those bells still triggered him. He could practically imagine her watching closely, ready to pounce on any mistake he made. The editor asked whether Shirmaki had been wearing those bells even back then. Tachikawa explained that among the artists who worked with her, there was a saying, because of how mercilessly she came knocking to collect manuscripts, the ringing of her bells was known as the Reaper's footsteps. Back at the boot camp, Maki announced that this was the invitational serialization boot camp. Whoever took first place would receive a full series along with a guaranteed anime adaptation. Whoever finished in last place would be added to the weekly Shonen Wonder blacklist and effectively exiled from the magazine. She asked all the participants whether they accepted these terms, and they all agreed. Maki smiled and remarked that there must be a reason behind Chibiki's cruelty. Chibiki rose from his chair and walked away, telling Maki that she was in charge of the first trial and instructing her to show no mercy. Maki retorted sharply, asking who he thought she was. Later, Miama looked around at the others with a puzzled expression. He fixated on the mention of the anime bonus, wondering if that meant whoever placed first would have their manga adapted into an anime. Akeo reacted by questioning whether his brain had short-circuited. Inakawa commented that Miama was giving off completely clueless vibes. Sasaki pointed out that all of them had been lured in by that tempting reward. After all, securing a regular series was not especially difficult as long as one kept drawing consistently. Miama grinned and agreed that it made sense. Oiwa asked whether Miama had not read the notice that had been sent out beforehand. Miama admitted that he had been blinded by excitement. Kamaya reacted with irritation, saying that people like Miama really got under his skin. He questioned whether Miama thought he could simply stroll into the professional world. Miama's one-shot had put him on guard, but now that illusion had shattered. Kamaya claimed he could tell that Miama only drew manga as a hobby. Miama responded that drawing was indeed fun for him, but he always took it seriously. Kamaya shot back that if that were true, then Miama should be prepared to sabotage as many competitors as possible. He explained that his own goal was simple. No matter what it took, he would break into the professional world faster than anyone else. He was not there to make friends or to enjoy himself, and he dismissed Miama's attitude as the hallmark of an amateur. Miama stared at him in silence. At that moment, Maki's earring rang, cutting through the tension. She told them that there had been enough chatting, and that it was time to get things moving. The first trial would be film appreciation. Miama and Oiwa immediately wondered what that entailed. Maki informed them that she would explain everything right there in the room. A staff member handed out materials for reference, and Oiwa immediately recognized what they were. Maki gathered everyone's attention and explained that they were all about to watch the same film. Once the screening ended, they would adapt the film into a 19-page storyboard, which would serve as the first trial. She explained that a storyboard was a rough draft used to work out paneling, dialogue placement, composition, and other elements. Even if the artwork was crude, it remained an indispensable part of the manga creation process. Maki was briefly interrupted by Akeo, who questioned whether they were truly expected to condense a 2-hour movie into 19 pages, arguing that such an attempt would amount to nothing more than a dull synopsis. Oiwa found himself in agreement. Miama, however, reasoned that there was no need to cover the entire plot. Maki affirmed this point. Kamaya refined the idea further, understanding that the goal was to select a scene they liked and adapt it into a piece of entertainment that could stand on its own without requiring full context. Sasaki summarized it as telling a complete 19-page story that even newcomers could enjoy. Inakawa reacted with excitement, likening it to creating a single chapter of a weekly series. Maki expressed her satisfaction that everyone was quick to grasp the intent. She then explained that the handouts contained the full script of the film, so there was no need to waste mental energy memorizing lines. The screening began. The title appeared, identifying the film as a 1973 American heist comedy. Its story centered on a young grifter who enlisted the aid of a legendary gambler to exact revenge on a crime syndicate by swindling its boss. The film blended action, humor, and unexpected twists, standing as a masterpiece packed with entertaining elements. Maki noted that the scenes each participant chose would vary dramatically depending on individual taste, which was precisely why this exercise served as the first trial. Through it, they were meant to reveal their true colors. When the film ended, Maki stopped the screening and added an important addendum. They would have only 3 hours to complete their storyboards. Inakawa was taken aback by how tight the time limit was. Maki continued by stating that anyone who failed to complete and submit their storyboard within the allotted time would be instantly disqualified. Oiwa realized that this meant immediate blacklisting, and Maki confirmed it, remarking that he should thank the deputy editor-in-chief for that rule. She emphasized again that submissions had to be complete. Any storyboard missing dialogue lines or falling short of the required page count would also result in disqualification. Inakawa muttered to himself that a single mistake would mean elimination. Kamiya observed that the rules seemed excessively harsh. Maki countered that they were entirely reasonable and stressed that deadlines were never to be taken lightly. Some weeks, creators might lament their inability to come up with new ideas. Other weeks, their pens might hesitate as nothing they drew lived up to their own expectations for climactic scenes. Yet week after week, without fail, the deadline would come knocking. The thought sent a chill through Kamiya. Maki went on to say that every deadline was a promise made to readers, one that creators must engrave into their hearts with absolute resolve. By then, the entire group was filled with tension and anticipation. Holding up a clock, Maki announced that, without further ado, the first trial would begin. At the opening of Chapter 9, the room was filled with nothing but the scratching of pens against paper and the relentless ticking of the clock. Miama focused on his pages, aware that the dialogue and plot were already fixed, yet struggling with the question of where to begin shaping them. Oiwa, on the other hand, was preoccupied with the opposite problem, contemplating where his story should end and what form its climax ought to take. Kamiya felt a surge of frustration. In his mind, there was no time to spare. Failing to meet the deadline meant immediate disqualification. A rare chance to secure a manga series, and even an anime adaptation, would vanish in an instant. Worse still, the door to wonder would be shut to him forever. The thought made him bristle. He felt as though fate was mocking him, piling this pressure on when he had no room for it. His thoughts drifted back to a memory of a man who had once given him 5 years. If Kamiya truly had the aptitude, that span of time should have been more than enough to produce tangible result. When asked whether he had any objections, Kamiya had accepted without hesitation, believing it was plenty. The man had begun to warn him about what would happen if he came up empty-handed, but Kamiya had cut him off by standing up. He had declared his intention to follow in the man's footsteps and demanded that he stop breathing down his neck. The man had dismissed his outburst, attributing it to being overly worked up about meaningless doodles, and blaming the foolish woman who had raised him. Even now, Kamiya rejected that notion in his heart, refusing to see himself as someone destined to return to his old man's side. Bringing his focus back to the present, Kamiya looked up and saw the clock. Only 30 minutes remained. He had several scenes in mind, with his top choice being the final twist of the film. Adapting that reveal would have been ideal, but it relied heavily on dense dialogue. Even summarizing it would take too long. His heart pounded as the seconds slipped away. Then Maki announced that only 10 minutes were left. Kamiya completed his work. In the end, he abandoned his first choice and went with his second, an action scene that could be conveyed more efficiently. Around him, Akio had already finished. Oiwa was still reviewing his pages, while Inakawa stared at his work with a hollow expression. Kamiya noticed that everyone else was deep into their final check. The looming threat of disqualification had clearly done its job. Managing deadlines, he reflected, was the very essence of serialization. Suddenly, the sound of paper tearing cut through the room. Kamiya was startled and turned to see Miama ripping up his own storyboard. Shock rippled through him. He wondered if Miama was still replacing panels at this stage. He watched as Miama erased lines and redrew them. Realization dawned that Miama had completely scrapped his work. Kamiya could hardly believe it. With only 10 minutes left, it felt like madness. He could not understand why Miama would risk everything by reworking his storyboard so late. As he observed more closely, Kamiya saw Miama sweating profusely. That was no surprise. Failing to finish would be a one-way ticket to the Wonder Blacklist, rendering all of Miama's efforts meaningless. Yet Miama persisted, muttering to himself that it was not over yet and that there was still room for improvement. That resolve caught Kamiya off guard once again. He recalled the idea that juggling deadlines defined serialization, but rejected it. Simply meeting deadlines amounted to nothing more than the bare minimum. Maki's voice rang out again, announcing that 5 minutes remained. As Maki watched Miama, she reflected on how he continued refining his work right up until the final moments, repeatedly revising under intense pressure in pursuit of the best possible result. She announced that 3 minutes remained. In her mind, this relentless refinement under constraint represented the true essence of serialization. Kamiya, meanwhile, felt a sense of doom settle over him. Looking inward, He realized that he had acted too hastily. He could not stand watching older creators succeed in the industry. He envied them, resented them, and even mocked them in his thoughts. He had been willing to drag them down if it meant achieving results himself. But now he understood that he had been wrong. That was not the right path. Undermining others or rushing desperately to prove himself would lead nowhere. What he should have been doing all along was focusing on creating the best manga he possibly could. When Maki announced that time was up, it became clear that everyone had managed to meet the deadline. Miema collapsed back into his chair in exhaustion. The completed works were laid out on the table. Maki explained that she would be responsible for evaluating them, estimating that it would take about an hour. In the meantime, she had prepared enough copies for everyone to review each participant's storyboard. While waiting, they were instructed to compare the others' work with their own. Kamaya looked visibly irritated. Miema's brightness was almost overwhelming to Oiwa. At the same time, Kamaya found himself impressed by Miema's fearless attitude when faced with danger. Still, he assumed that such reckless last-minute revisions must have come at the cost of quality. Because of that, he felt something close to sympathy. However, in that very moment, Kamaya realized something deeper. No matter the circumstances, a dragon would soar, even if it did not do so swiftly. It was as though he could see feathers scattering from the creature as it took flight. He clenched his teeth. Akeo inwardly cursed Miema. Inakawa, by contrast, openly expressed how much she loved Miema's work. Oiwa reacted with shock, immediately grasping what Miema had done. Miema, for his part, seemed delighted, enjoying the opportunity to see everyone's unique interpretations. Kamaya approached Miema, prompting Oiwa to feel a sense of weary resignation, having expected more trouble. Earlier, Miema had stepped between them, and Oiwa had been ready to intervene again if things escalated. However, before he could follow that thought through, Kamaya humbly asked to look at the discarded pages on Miema's desk. He was curious about how Miema had arrived at his final version, while acknowledging that Miema was free to refuse. Miema readily agreed, suggesting instead that they make it an exchange. In return, Kamaya should show him his own creative process. Oiwa was reminded of how Miema had once excitedly tried to draw others into enthusiastic discussions about manga theory, only for Kamaya to feel patronized and for both of them to be described as incompatible, like oil and water. As Kamaya examined the discarded pages, he was struck by disbelief at Miema's decision to throw away what looked like perfectly solid work. Miema's reasoning was that pushing the drama too far would have diminished the impact of the climax. Elsewhere, back at the publishing office, Tachikawa took a sip from his cup and casually wondered what everyone else was up to. The staff members noticed Tachikawa and brought up the topic of the boot camp, wondering aloud whether he knew about it and speculating among themselves about who might emerge as the winner. Tachikawa responded dryly, suggesting that they must have too much free time on their hand. They pressed further, asking whether, as Miema's editor, he was confident in Miema's chances. Tachikawa reflected that throughout the magazine's history, whenever a flagship series approached its conclusion, a gifted newcomer would inevitably appear, stepping forward as if to inherit the baton of greatness and fill the looming void. With the end of Doragon Land now in sight, he felt that history was repeating itself once again. Someone asked if he was referring to Miema. Tachikawa dismissed that assumption and revealed that Wonder possessed a hidden ace instead. He spoke of a new breed of talent, someone who might even surpass Gario Hanagami in sheer ability. In his estimation, that rising prodigy was Taman Sasaki, likened to a tiger cub poised to grow into something formidable. It was now the first night of the boot camp. Miema brought up the topic of the fourth trial, recalling that it had been mentioned after the first trial concluded. Oiwa confirmed this and explained that the fourth and final trial, scheduled for the last day, would award double points. He wondered aloud what form such a decisive challenge might take. Miema reflected that this kind of structure was typical of show business. Kiyama added that it created the possibility of a dramatic comeback, speculating that the final trial might closely resemble the realities of working on an actual serialized series. Oiwa then questioned why Kamaya was present in their room. Kamaya pointed out that it had taken Oiwa quite a while to even ask. Miema explained that he had found Kamaya alone in the foyer earlier. Kamaya admitted that he had reluctantly agreed to join them. Oiwa concluded that Kamaya must be enjoying himself at least a little. Kamaya countered that his own room felt unbearably tense, explaining that staying next to a particular contestant was exhausting. That night, owls perched outside the window before taking flight into the darkness. Kamaya likened his situation to being trapped in a cage with a wild beast, a comment that sent a shiver through Oiwa. Miema remarked that such an intense, beast-like aura suggested extreme focus. Oiwa privately noted the irony, given Miama's own intensity. Kamiya agreed, acknowledging that the contestant in question had produced an extraordinarily impressive storyboard in the first trial. Miama concurred, admitting that he himself had suffered a bitter defeat as a result. Oiwa suggested that the judge's personal tastes might have influenced the outcome and reassured Miama that his work had been outstanding as well. Miama rejected that consolation, recognizing that the other contestants' work had clearly surpassed his own. He reflected that new talents were rapidly closing in, threatening to overwhelm the old guard, and saw this predicament as the perfect opportunity to identify and confront his own shortcomings. Kamiya asked whether Oiwa had stepped into another cage as well, and Oiwa readily agreed. The following day, Maki announced the second trial, titled Sprinting Start. The participants would have the entire day to draw a manuscript covering the first 4 pages of a story. The completed works would be published on the company's Manga app, and rankings would be determined by reader vote. Oiwa was taken aback by the scope of the task. Completing 4 fully inked pages with screen tones in a single day still amounted to a brutal deadline. Kamiya focused inwardly, reminding himself that he needed to make a strong impression and leave readers eager for more. He pushed himself to think relentlessly and make use of every remaining second. When the results of the second trial were announced, Miama placed first, Sasaki second, Kamiya third, Yakuno fourth, Inakawa fifth, and Oiwa sixth. Sasaki glanced toward Miama, who responded with a confident smirk and extended his fist. Sasaki visibly twitched in response. Inakawa appeared disappointed by her 5th-place finish. Chibiki then revealed that the third trial would focus on character creation. All genres were permitted. The participants were instructed to let their plots inform their character designs and backstories, drawing as many characters as possible. Oiwa approached the task with determination. He resolved that each design should have a distinct silhouette and that every backstory should clearly emphasize the character's relationship to the protagonist. He intended to fully mobilize his skills and strike decisively on the page. The results of the third trial placed Sasaki in first, Miama in second, and Oiwa in third. Oiwa felt a surge of joy at having broken into the top 3. His satisfaction dimmed slightly when he noticed that Inakawa's name once again appeared in 5th place. Later that night, a knock sounded at the door. Miama opened it and was surprised to find Yakuno standing there. Yakuno asked whether Inakawa was present, then immediately realized she was not. Oiwa scolded Miama internally for failing to warn them beforehand, thinking that the situation made him come across as unsettling. Miama sensed that something was wrong and asked what had happened. Yakuno explained that she had discovered something in her room, the kind of thing every runaway girl leaves behind when she wants to be found. It was a small slip of paper telling others not to look for Inakawa. Yakuno added that Inakawa's belongings were gone, so she concluded that Inakawa had fled. She dismissed Inakawa as a spineless coward. Miama was stunned by the realization. It was already late at night, and there were no buses or trains running. Inakawa was clearly putting herself in danger. Yakuno responded coldly that she did not care. Inakawa was not a child. Yakuno stormed off, saying she would inform the editors, and made it clear that this was as far as she was willing to get involved. Kamiya peeked out from the doorway and remarked on Yakuno's lack of compassion. Oiwa, peering out behind him, pointed out the irony of that judgment coming from Kamiya. Miama admitted that he could not help but worry. Oiwa reminded him that it was late and that the crucial final trial was scheduled for the next day. He reasoned that they should be able to trust the editors to handle the situation. Oiwa himself felt shaken, while Kamiya found himself agreeing with Yakuno's stance. Still, the reality remained that none of them knew where Inakawa had gone, and the area outside was barely lit at all. Miama asked them to leave the matter to him. He declared that this was a job for the Midnight Rider. Out in the woods, Inakawa walked alone, singing softly. Her song spoke of dark skies overhead, tears in her eyes, and the absence of light around her, with horror filling her thoughts. It carried sorrow and pain, an invitation to face everything head-on, calling others to seek a spooky promenade. A truck slowed to a stop nearby. The driver asked what a girl like her was doing out so late and whether she was lost, warning that the next town was quite far away. Inakawa replied calmly that it was fine, because she liked the dark and intended to take her time walking. The driver pointed out that the distance was not an easy one to cover on foot, especially given her slender legs. Inakawa did not seem to understand the implication. The driver stepped closer, insisting that he was only acting for her own good. Inakawa grew confused as he told her not to be shy and reached out, taking her hand while she hesitated. At that moment, a voice intervened, stating that she would be fine. Miama appeared from the darkness. Inakawa immediately recognized him. Miama informed the driver that he would take Inakawa where she needed to go. The driver asked Inakawa whether Miama was her friend. Inakawa confirmed that they were the best of friends. The driver scoffed at Miama, who met his gaze without backing down. The driver then feigned innocence, saying he was relieved to hear it, remarking that the area was dangerous. He claimed to have a daughter around the same age, and said he had only been worried. Admitting that he might have been a little too pushy, he offered an apology. The driver climbed back into his truck, telling them to take care of themselves. Before leaving, he tossed out a parting remark to Miama, urging him to be a good boyfriend and keep her safe. Miama, flustered, reflexively agreed. The truck soon pulled away into the darkness. Inakawa immediately teased Miama for failing to deny being called her boyfriend. Miama apologized, explaining that he had simply been caught off guard. Inakawa brushed it aside and acknowledged that he had saved her. Ghosts did not bother her, she admitted, but humans were far more frightening. Miama wondered how that could be, then shifted gears and said he would inform Iwachi that he had found her. Inakawa complained about having to walk so slowly and asked why they could not just hurry back on his bike. Miama explained that riding together on a public road was illegal. Inakawa snapped back, calling him a goody two-shoes. Miama then asked why she had run away in the first place. Inakawa explained that she could not stand being ranked, judged, and evaluated. She hated being told what was wrong with her work or what made it bad. From the very beginning, she had drawn manga simply because it was fun. Lately, however, that sense of fun had been fading. The boot camp had made her feel as though she was starting to hate drawing manga. She understood, on an intellectual level, that this was what happened when a passion was turned into a job. She really did get it. Even so, what terrified her more than ghosts or even other people was the possibility of growing to hate something she had once loved. She asked Miama whether he had ever felt that way himself, whether he had ever been on the verge of hating manga. Miama admitted that he had. Inakawa was shocked, because he always looked as though he was enjoying himself. Miama recalled a time when he was still Gario Hanagami, answering phone calls with barely any energy left in him. In the present, he explained that he kept going because he believed one thing with absolute certainty: if he stayed with manga through both the good times and the bad, he would eventually come to love it more than ever. Inakawa's eyes lit up as she listened. She understood what he meant. With renewed resolve, she suddenly hopped onto the bike. Miama protested, reminding her again that it was illegal. Inakawa countered that the land they were on was part of the residence and not a public road. Miama was about to argue further, but she urged him on instead. Relenting, he agreed and told her to hold on tightly. She promised she would. She declared that she would work hard just like Miama, continuing to draw manga until she fell in love with it all over again. Later, the two of them received a severe scolding. Early on the morning of the fourth day of boot camp, the participants were taken down to the basement of the Vernal Summit House. The space was an intensive workroom designed for total concentration. Maki announced that the final day had arrived, but before beginning, she reviewed the current point totals. Akeo Yakuno and Genji Oiwa each stood at 7 points. Hayato Kamiya and Fumimai Inakawa had 8 points apiece. Shinobu Miama was far ahead with 16 points, followed closely by Taman Sasaki at 17. Kamiya observed that the group had clearly split into two extremes. Oiwa pointed out that double points were available for this final trial. Maki confirmed this, explaining that everyone still had a chance to either win outright or at least tie for first place. Inakawa commented on the room they had been dragged into so early in the morning for the final trial. Despite being underground with no windows, it had the atmosphere of a living space. Taking into account the stockpile of food and the unusually early start time, the contestants began to sense what was coming. Maki noted that those with prior assistant experience already seemed to understand the situation. At that moment, someone descended the stairs. It was Chibiki, who welcomed them to what he called creative seclusion. This referred to the practice of a manga artist shutting themselves away in a location such as a hotel room, working non-stop on a manuscript until the deadline. The group looked at Chibiki as he spoke. Maki remarked that Chibiki's aura was unbalanced, with most of it concentrated around his head. Oiwa murmured that it was a strange power, and Kamiya silently agreed. Maki placed something on the table and distributed sheets to everyone, instructing them to examine what was in front of them. Miama immediately recognized it as a copy of his published one-shot. Chibiki then explained the rules of the final trial. Each participant was to use their own one-shot as a foundation and draw a storyboard for the first chapter of a serialized work. The deadline was set for 6 in the evening. Kamaya reflected that he had expected a trial with no frills. To Oiwa, the amount of time felt abundant yet somehow insufficient. Chibiki added a harsh condition. Anyone who failed to meet the deadline would be disqualified. Miama noted that the page requirement was 50 pages. This trial represented the culmination of everything they had experienced so far. First, they had learned to choose which elements of a one-shot to highlight and expand, as in the first trial focused on film appreciation. Next, they had been trained to ensure a powerful hook in the opening chapter, as in the second trial, the sprinting start. Then they had worked on creating an expanding cast of appealing characters, as in the third trial. Seen this way, the entire boot camp must have been designed backward from a single goal, transforming rookies who specialized in one-shots into artists capable of sustaining a serialization. Miama inwardly acknowledged the careful planning behind it, crediting the deputy editor-in-chief. Chibiki then added one final detail. The judging for the last trial would be conducted by the creator of Doragon Land himself, Gario Hanagami. The announcement stunned everyone. Miama felt a sense of doom wash over him as the group reacted all at once. Kamaya, in particular, could hardly believe that the king of the industry himself would be judging them. Oiwa muttered a familiar nickname under his breath. Yakuno found it hard to believe that the situation was real. Inakawa was overwhelmed by the thought that the legendary Hanagami himself would actually be reading their storyboards, finding the idea completely insane. Maki explained that, due to Gario Hanagami's packed schedule, the results of the judging would be announced at a later date. She also stated that Gario had agreed to set aside all personal biases during the evaluation process, acknowledging that some of the participants were already acquainted with him. Miama could scarcely accept that claim. In his mind, there was no way that the chameleon-like creator could truly put aside his personal feelings where Miama was concerned. He imagined himself being bitten down on by that chameleon, only to sense something even more frightening behind him, like the rumble of a far greater beast. Sasaki's expression was deadly serious. In Miama's perception, before him stood a chameleon mimicking a dragon, while behind him lurked a ravenous tiger snapping at his heels. Faced with enemies on both sides, there was no room left for hesitation. It was a matter of life or death. Chibiki declared that this final trial would serve to bring the entire boot camp to its conclusion. Maki urged them to make it count and gave the signal to begin. Every contestant set to work with fire burning in their eyes. Miama resolved that he would survive the chopping block and rise, soaring to heights even greater than before. On the first day of the boot camp, Maki commended the contestants for their strong performance in the trial. Though it might have seemed slightly belated, she then asked one of the contestants whether he would be willing to sit down for an interview. The filming would be done from behind and the rest of the participants would step up one by one. When it was Oiwa's turn, he was asked how excited he was to be attending the boot camp. He answered that he intended to treat this as his final chance and would pour everything he had into it. Yakuno was asked what she prioritized most when creating manga, to which she replied with a single-minded focus on energy and drive. Inakawa was asked how she was preparing herself for a professional career, and she answered in a playful, sing-song manner, likening it to a solitary game of hide-and-seek. Kamaya was asked about his strengths as a manga artist, but he declined to answer, reasoning that anything he said would cause readers to form preconceived notions about his future work. Sasaki was asked why he wanted to become a manga artist, and he answered that it was so he would not have to deal with people. On the final day, Oiwa sat outside eating, thinking to himself how peaceful it felt away from the underground workspace. Inakawa soon joined him. He asked whether she was taking a lunch break as well, and she replied that she was, adding that she was glad they were allowed to escape their seclusion and come outside for a moment. Oiwa commented that they were in it for the long haul. Inakawa asked how things were going, and Oiwa admitted that he was stressed. He reflected that it really was true that creating a one-shot and creating a full serialized work required entirely different muscles. Having finished his meal, he decided to head back inside. Inakawa remarked that he ate lightly for someone of his size, and Oiwa explained that he would become sleepy if he ate too much. Inakawa insisted there was no way he would fall asleep, especially not in that room. Inside, the atmosphere felt as though a tiger and a dragon were clashing head-on. Yakuno sensed the overwhelming pressure radiating from the two of them and wondered what was going on. In Kamaya's mind, the situation had long since gone beyond merely sharing a room with a beast. At that moment, there were two outright monsters beside him, locked in a silent struggle. The only sound filling the room was the scratching of pens against paper. Sasaki glared across the room. As he looked at Miama, he recalled words he had once heard. That at the beginning, everyone is the same. At the start, they all bring their best fight and manage to keep pace, trading blow for blow. But that equality only exists at the beginning. He remembered being told to smile, and memories surfaced from his past, when someone had remarked that he had won. That person said he himself had trained harder than anyone else for as long as he could remember, having been born under immense expectations as the son of a dojo master. And yet, it had taken Sasaki only a single year to achieve what he never could. At the very least, Sasaki was told, he ought to be happy about that. The man hurled curse after curse as he recalled how he had approached Sasaki back in school, only for everything to end there. He regretted ever inviting Sasaki in the first place. For Sasaki, whether in academics or sports, any effort he invested was repaid with results that came back doubled. But that was not how the world worked for everyone else. Some people poured in the same effort and received only a fraction of the reward. He understood that all too well. The disparity was absurd, infuriating even. Life felt like a broken game where starting stats determined everything. And yet, there was nothing he could do about it. His thoughts drifted back to a moment in the office. Maki had told Sasaki not to misunderstand her. His work was undeniably impressive. However, being a manga artist was not a solitary endeavor. Editors shaped the story alongside the artist, while assistants supported the artwork throughout a series run. Sasaki had responded that, in that case, they could simply skip such meetings and that he would draw at the pace of a weekly serialization entirely on his own. Maki had then cited the creator of Doragon Land, Gario Hanagami, as an example. For a 19-page chapter, Gario spent 3 days planning the story and 4 days drawing it, with assistants joining him for 3 of those days. Even with his speed and experience, Gario could not avoid working late into the night. To match that pace alone, Sasaki would have to complete a 45-page one-shot in 9 days, something that even Hanagami himself would struggle to accomplish. Sasaki had responded by scratching at the table. Maki had told him that his proposal was reckless, covering her mouth the moment the words slipped out. Sasaki had countered with the suggestion that perhaps that was simply because Gario was a talentless hack. In the end, Sasaki did exactly what he claimed he would. He completed 45 pages in 9 days and placed first in the reader survey, even though Doragon Land happened to be on hiatus that week. Later, in their office, Maki confided to Chibiki that it had felt as though Sasaki had torn her jaw clean off back then. Sasaki's extreme concentration multiplied his efficiency many times over. Chibiki remarked that he could hardly believe such a defiant artist had joined the boot camp at all. Maki insisted that she had done everything she could to persuade him. It was not that Sasaki preferred to be alone by nature, but rather that he had given up on associating with others entirely. Before solitude consumed him completely, she hoped he might encounter a worthy rival. It was like Miama stepping into a dojo to challenge Sasaki. Sasaki would immediately point out that the techniques Miama used were not karate. Even so, the two would still clash. With that thought lingering, the narrative returned to the present conversation. Chibiki remarked that it was often said that when an era turned and a flagship series neared its conclusion, a rising star would inevitably appear to take up the baton. Maki responded that she had heard the same saying countless times back at the office. Chibiki continued, explaining that the truth ran far deeper than a simple succession. It was through friendly rivalries that uncut gems, inspired by the fading brilliance of the stars before them, clashed and sharpened one another as they struggled to become the next guiding lights. There was nothing coincidental about it. The torchbearers of every new generation were born from the blazing resolve of the youth of that era. Back at the boot camp, Sasaki found himself wondering what exactly was happening. He had known from the start that Miama would never yield. There was no doubt in his mind that Miama possessed the talent to chase him down. But the question remained, how? How were the others maintaining such intensity? Hadn't these 4 days clearly demonstrated the gap in their abilities? Did they truly fear coming in last place that much? Sasaki dismissed the thought almost immediately. Oiwa, meanwhile, was resolved not to give up. He had come this far with the intention of staying, determined to secure a series of his own. In Kamaya's mind, every remaining second would be used to refine his storyboard as much as possible. Inakawa felt that the process was no longer fun and that she had wanted to run away, yet at the same time she longed to grow to love manga even more deeply than before. Yakuno, for her part, was irritated that every single one of them seemed to be under Shinobu Miama's spell. Acknowledging her own simplicity, she lifted her head and surveyed the room. Switching fully into gear, she decided that she would ride the wave of Miama's rock and roll momentum. Sasaki looked at them all in silence. Elsewhere, within the ongoing conversation, Maki hoped that Sasaki would come to realize something important. None of them shunned him, nor did they envy his talent. They were simply formidable rivals who would spare no effort in creating compelling manga. Sasaki paused, his pen held still in his hand. Later that day, Sasaki stepped outside and spotted Miama sitting by the stairs, eating. He approached and took a seat beside him. Sasaki stole a brief glance at Miama before returning his attention to his own meal and offering a quiet blessing. Without warning, Miama spoke with firm resolve, declaring that it was far from over and that he had no intention of losing. Sasaki smiled in response. 3 hours remained until the final trial would come to an end, and with it, the fate of Shinobu Miama, also known as Garyo Hanagami, would be sealed. Miama then stood up to head back inside, only to suddenly jolt in place. Sasaki noticed the change at once. Miama's eyes widened as something unexpected caught his attention. At the start of Chapter 13, Miama's heart was pounding and he was silently panting. Sasaki noticed his condition and checked on him. Miama narrowed his eyes, clutched his chest, and let out a breath, indicating that something had gone wrong. He attributed it to food getting stuck while he was eating too quickly. Sasaki accepted the explanation. Miama then moved away, remarking that this was what happened when he rushed and advising Sasaki not to do the same, adding that there was no need for a response. He let out a small chuckle as he left. Later, with only 3 hours remaining in the final trial, Miama's body felt unbearably heavy. His thoughts were clouded and his pen refused to move. He had completely exceeded his limit. Looking back, he realized that over the past few days he had been pushing himself to an extreme. The fatigue he had kept suppressed surged back all at once. Even though he had tried to be careful, this body was not his own. It was only a borrowed vessel, unlike the reliable partner he had worked with through 8 years of serialization. He clutched his chest again and jolted, cursing inwardly as the sensation returned. The obstruction was back. It was like being outside at night and catching sight of a figure at the edge of one's vision, only for it to turn out to be something entirely different when properly looked at. It was a misfiring of the brain, similar to the phenomenon known as pareidolia, an illusion caused by the overwhelming amount of visual information processed in the periphery. In the past, this had often occurred after Miama pulled an all-nighter. When his brain was completely drained, he would perceive the shape of a human standing just outside his direct line of sight. No matter how many times he checked and confirmed that no one was there, the presence would linger at the edge of his vision once he looked away again. The worst part was that every time it appeared, it robbed him of his ability to concentrate on his manuscript. He forced himself to ignore it, repeatedly convincing himself that nothing was there. He directed his focus back to the storyboard. He was already nearing the climax. When outlining the plot, he had established several scenes to act as checkpoints, markers that would guide him steadily toward the peak. Sometimes his characters refused to move according to his plans. Other times, the most direct path to the next checkpoint was blocked. In those situations, he always prioritized the characters themselves. Detour or not, he would guide them forward with care. In his mind, the scene took shape. The protagonist would rush forward, and the rescued boy would respond appropriately. But Miama stopped and examined the character more closely. This moment involved the protagonist, the ace of the Sky Brigade, and a boy from a village under attack by sky pirates. He shook his head. The boy's expression as it was already worked well enough. It would make the protagonist stand out more clearly. Adding unnecessary elements would only confuse the readers. Then another thought surfaced. Perhaps the feeling conveyed should be closer to admiration. The story he had been constructing centered on a sickly boy who, after nearly giving up on himself, finds the resolve to stand again and set out on an adventure. When circumstances become overwhelming, the boy may turn his back on his dream and flee. Yet along a brutal journey, he is supported by friends and rivals who push him forward and become the catalysts for his growth. Through both Doragon Land and Miama's final one-shot, he had consistently demonstrated his specialty, portraying a heroic protagonist. And yet, something felt off to him now. As he considered the possibility of making this boy the protagonist instead, Miama froze. His body jolted. In that instant, the pieces fell neatly into place for Hanagami. He had found the key that would guide him toward overcoming his long-standing flaw. The realization struck him clearly. Miama was capable of drawing this. A protagonist like this boy could pursue his dreams with a presence that felt vivid, grounded, and unmistakably real. He checked the time. Just over 2 hours remained before the deadline. He hesitated, weighing the option of redrawing everything from the ground up. He immediately dismissed it. There was no time. Physically, it could not be done. Accepting that reality, he resolved to focus on the current storyboard and pour this newfound feeling into future work. But then the shadow intruded. It urged him not to save it for later. It reminded him that he knew better than anyone how ideas work. If he did not bring them to life the moment they appeared, they would never emerge into the world. The shadow now possessed a face, and it pressed him mercilessly, taking on the form of his rival and delivering a sharp, uncompromising exhortation born from his own inner voice. For the sake of a distant victory, Gario Hanagami chose to violate a taboo he had long observed. Eventually, time ran out. Oiwa let out a breath of relief, and then glanced toward someone nearby. What he saw made him stiffen in shock. Shinobu Miyama had failed to submit his work before the deadline and was disqualified.